Thank you, Oren, for hosting me and Tally for organizing this and for the audience for appearing. It's a very important topic, and I'm glad we get an opportunity to focus in on the question. And as we know, Wikistrat's had a lead role in thinking about future scenarios in this and other areas. So, I'm eager to hear people's insights. I'll give a presentation that will focus on some of the summit results, which were not that many at present that are known. So there'll be a short part, then I'll focus in more detail on the larger trends in the Russia-China relationship, especially since the Ukraine war began in full earnest in February 2022. And then I'll briefly speculate about what we might see in the future. But the focus will be in section 2 when we delve down into detail about the particular domains and dimensions of the Russia-China relationship. So I think what we saw a lot of focus on messaging. There was a big emphasis on how important the relationship was between Russia and China, in particular the top leaders. They were celebrating the 75th anniversary of the relations, and by various counts, this is the 43rd time that Xi and Putin had met, either in person or virtually. We typically see the leaders of Russia and China in recent years go to the others' capitals, particularly after major events in their domestic political scene. So Xi went last year in March, which was the previous of my topic of my previous Wikistrat seminar, and we after he received his unprecedented third term, and now we see President Putin reciprocate go to China as his first country on an official state visit following his inauguration as president again. The main outcome so far has been this lengthy 7,000-word joint statement. It talks a lot about what their views of the world, the principles they support, their broad goals. It's big emphasis on we're in a new era in global politics, leading towards a multipolar and therefore better world. A lot of specific critiques on various U.S. policies that they object to, particularly in the security domain. But in general, we don't have a lot of detail about what the deliverables were. They said they've agreed on a new, making more progress on economic and security and other areas, but most of the conversations on these took place in secret, or at least in closed doors. So not only do we know precisely what they've agreed to, but we often don't know who attended. We can sort of guess from the Russian side. So both the previous and former defense ministers were there. So that implies they probably talk about Ukraine, but we don't know who on the Chinese side attended many of these. So it's often, as with the previous summit in March of last year, it often takes a few months to see what, if any, changes have occurred. But there were a couple noticeable developments. Observers were looking to see whether they would finally consummate their commitment to set up a Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. That did not occur. Indeed, the head of Gazprom didn't even attend. So mostly we just have memorandums of understanding or statements of principles that they will cooperate, but specific details remain to be seen. So more interestingly, if we step back and think about where we are in the relationship, a lot of focus has rightly been on China's policies towards Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as people like to refer to it. And, we've seen China provide substantial and arguably critical economic, diplomatic, and quasi-military assistance to Russia. And China's gained a lot of benefits from this, keeping Russia going without really paying high costs so far, and at least in relations with the West. And indeed, Xi came back the previous week from trip to Europe, which he arguably arguably saw as somewhat successful in keeping Europe divided and not overtly as anti-China as we've seen, and we'll probably see even more in U.S. policies. The Russian analysts, the writers, seem to be pleased with China's policies. I don't think they anticipated receiving weapons or Chinese military assistance overtly, but certainly they welcome the assistance they've been getting and helping to make up for some of the losses Russia has suffered from severing ties with the West, not all of them. This also helps President Putin show that he can still travel to foreign countries despite his being under indictment by the International Criminal Court, and China will readily host him as among others. So it seems to be still working well. Chinese officials haven't publicly criticized Russian actions in Ukraine or seem to do anything to try and end the conflict overtly. The Chinese policies are still pretty much those laid out in the February 2023 white paper, when they've listed a series of principles they'd like to see embedded in a settlement, talked about upholding international law, posing nuclear threats, ensuring non-disruption of international supply chains and the international economy. In general, though, this paper, like Chinese policy, tilts more towards Moscow's position. A lot of criticism about the expanding of military blocs and Cold War mentality, implying the U.S. is responsible for the continued failure to reach a peace agreement. They're also critical of Western provisions of weapons to Ukraine implicitly. The text, and most importantly, didn't call for an immediate and called a conflict a war, didn't demand the restoration of Ukraine's boundaries, that is, Russian withdrawal from the recently occupied, or let alone all the occupied territories in Ukraine, didn't call for punishment for war crimes, and so on. In the UN, China has still largely not been critical of Russian policies. Xi has met several times with Zelensky since February 2020. With Putin since 2022. He's only had one phone call with Zelensky, head of Ukraine. There have been three major peace conferences on Ukraine. China only attended one of them, and that may have been simply just to brief the Russians on what happened. Now, it's true China has not provided lethal military assistance to Russia. We haven't seen them selling tanks or warships or missiles to Russia, but they provided a lot of non-lethal items, helmets, armor. They've also helped sustain the Russian economy by buying substantial hydrocarbons, sometimes circumventing U.S. and Western price caps. And most importantly has been this dual supply of dual-use items, advanced electronic components, satellite imagery, high-tech machine tools, and so on, which U.S. officials believe has been essentially explains the rapid restoration of the Russian military-industrial complex despite the Western sanctions. In my view, China has some competing interests at play, and at the Ukraine war, currently it's gaining a diversion of Western attention and resources that might otherwise be focused on the Indo-Pacific region. So it's similar to the Middle East conflicts in the past, which helped keep the Asia pivot from reaching its full potential under Obama. The conflict, China has been able to take a stance of saying we're for peace without really having to do anything to try and force the parties to compromise or reach a concrete deal. It's given, as we mentioned, China a lot of substantial commercial opportunities. As Western firms have fled the Russian market, so Chinese companies have moved in. China is now the leading supplier of foreign cars and other items to Russians. the conflict has harmed China's image in the West, which, and I think they've been trying to manage that with only partial success in Europe and not much success here in the US. It has deprived China of some other opportunities. For example, the Arctic Council, where China was hoping to expand its influence in the Arctic, has been basically dysfunctional since the war began. It has awakened fears in Asia, just as Russia launched a surprise attack against Ukraine, so China might launch a surprise attack against Taiwan, and made particularly the Japanese take a much harder stance on global security and mobilize who we know, getting a new president inaugurated today, have been able to generate more concern about the possibility of further aggression by the authoritarian states, i.e. China trying to seize control of Taiwan. And the Chinese have seemed uneasy about whenever the fighting goes near a nuclear power plant in Ukraine or President Putin makes nuclear threats and so on. But in general, I think that the Chinese are satisfied with how the war has been going. Certainly they don't want to see a Russian defeat, which could open up all sorts of problems in terms of long-term influence in Eurasia, and possibly, if Putin is deposed, lead to a new Russian government that would seek to reconcile with the West. And so they've been benefiting a lot from the conflict without really paying much costs. That said, the Ukraine conflict hasn't really had a major impact in the trajectory of Russia-China relations in recent years. It perhaps accelerated some developments, particularly of economics, but we didn't see China look at what Russia did and say, oh, we've got to disengage from Putin. He's crazy. Look what he's doing in Ukraine. Just as COVID would have been an opportunity for both Russia and China to disengage from each other because of for example, the Russians could have said, well, look, the Chinese economy is not as solid as we thought. Their secrecy is a problem for our health security. But I think these kind of stability of this alignment to survive these shocks just shows how robust it is. Still, it hasn't resulted in a major change. In time, it's just been increasingly close relationship. We've seen China increasingly get the upper hand in terms of the influence and the economic dominance over Russia, but that was occurring even before the war began. They still cooperate mostly in the same areas as before, that is Central and East Asia. Whereas their policies in Europe, South Asia, Middle East, and especially Latin America and Africa are not closely aligned, at least visibly, except perhaps in the information domain. In terms of politics and diplomacy, we still see, some cooperation on particularly joint statements. We saw a lot of this in the recent statement, criticism of expansion of NATO and what the U.S. is doing in the Indo-Pacific, constructing these similar blocks with AUKUS and the Quad, criticism of U.S. missile defenses, complained about their navigation patrols, complaints that the U.S. is trying to militarize space, interfering in other countries' internal affairs, and this is general critique that Russian and Chinese interests are not being taken into account. That the U.S. is trying to expand it and improve its security at the expense of other states, i.e. Russia and China. In the UN and other international institutions, we've seen them align closely on various either dual vetoes, or Russia takes the lead in vetoing something and China abstains, as we saw with the recent decision of the UN Security Council not to renew the mandate of the panel overlooking North Korean sanctions. We've seen a rejection of this whole idea of a rule-based international order, which the Japanese and the Americans have been pushing. They want to stick to traditional notions of UN-led sovereignty. In terms of the information domain, we've seen a lot of similar Chinese messaging that just reinforces the Russian message about, well, the West is responsible for the war in Ukraine. It started, it's trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. It's keeping it going by providing weapons to Ukraine. That the U.S. sanctions are designed to weaken Russia and China and help U.S. businesses, and so on. In terms of economics and technology and so on, the war has clearly solidified China's role as Russia's dominant trading partner and boosted Russia's importance to China economically, at least in the aggregate size. And, as I mentioned, China's taking advantage of discounted Russian oil and gas prices. Their companies have moved in, take dominant positions in terms of smartphones and automobiles. They've been working to circumvent Western sanctions through promoting de-dollarization. Putin was boasting this past week that more than 90% or approximately 90% of the trade between two countries is now in yuan and rubles, and this means they can avoid Western financial sanctions. And the trade has increased. It's now at a record 240 billion for last year. There's been a slight downturn in Chinese exports to Russia. We're still trying to determine if that's durable or just a fluke. If it's durable, this may reflect Chinese concerns about what they heard from Blinken and other U.S. officials who have been there recently, warning them that the U.S. was going to start sanctioning Chinese banks and so on because of its helping to sustain Russia's military operations in Ukraine through the dual-use transfers we talked about earlier. But the relationship is still economically pretty much the same structure, the Russia providing raw materials, particularly hydrocarbons, to China, and receiving more machine tools, consumer goods, other types of higher high-tech or higher value products. The de-dollarization has worked pretty well for their bilateral trade, but it hasn't extended often to third parties. The Russians, for example, have gotten to a problem with India and that they can't really spend the rubles, the Indian currency they've been getting, rupees, I think it is. Their regional economic plans, integrating the Chinese Belt and Road structure with the Eurasian Economic Union that the Russians are promoting, has not made any visible progress. We don't have this Power Siberia 2 pipeline. I think the Chinese are happy making sure they can get gas not only from Russia, but also from Central Asia and other sources. This has meant that China has helped, but not totally made up for the loss of Russian gas exports to Europe through its own purchases. Military and security partnership still remains very strong. We have these exercises that are continued. Fewer ground forces, understandably, since Russian ground forces are so heavily involved in Ukraine, but air and naval forces continue to have regular drills, often jointly circumventing Korea or in particular Japan. They've engaged with third parties, South Africa, Iran, and so on, in these small drills. We're still waiting to see what's going to happen with these joint defense industrial projects they've announced. They haven't visibly made much progress, but we just don't know. The visibility of what they do in terms of their bilateral arms trade and defense cooperation has gone down a lot in recent years as they've tried to shield those from Western sanctions and making them more opaque. In terms of their arms control policy, still very harmonious. We've seen them, Russia in any kind of strategic arms control agreement, and China hasn't criticized Russia for suspending implementation of New START, placing nuclear weapons in Belarus, or doing other things. They've been helping defend Iran and especially North Korea and various international fora. and they're also jointly denouncing the nuclear policies of the U.S. and its allies. So what might happen in the future? They made this statement. They said this is the best time in history, their relationship. They've been saying that for several years. It's true. I mean, in the hundreds of years of history of the relationship, it's probably between Moscow and Beijing, it probably hasn't been any better. That's not saying that much, given that they've often been at war, had very poor relations, but it still leaves potential for further growth. You could see a substantial step up in their cooperation. That might include, for example, they're establishing a full-blown alliance. Putin has had that can't be precluded. The Chinese have expressed disinterest in that. They claim they don't want foreign military alliances. They don't really need one. They seem to be doing all the cooperation that you would want from an alliance without having to formally call it as such. It gives them a little more flexibility. They claim that what they have now is just as good as alliance, in some ways better, and in some ways they're right just because of that, the flexibility. But you could see one perhaps move much closer in terms of actual formal alliance if they felt threatened by the U.S. or some other factor force that. Alternately, you could see them regress to their past pattern of divisions. They've not always been partners and allies. They've been in recent years. Putin and Xi are both old. Xi's 70, Putin 71. New leaders may arise to power at some point. They may have a new perspective. Certainly many Russians must wonder about the wisdom of this practice of basically bandwagoning or appeasing China as something that as a long-term foreign policy. I mean, under Putin, you can't really challenge it. That's perhaps his most important foreign policy achievement. He's pretty much thrown his whole hat in that's this China-focused relationship. It's hard to see him ever repudiating that. A new leader, though, may want to try and restore relations with the West as part of a larger package of withdrawing from Ukraine and taking other steps. May not be the leader after Putin, but the leader after the successor to Putin. That might be possible. Chinese politics too. You've also seen changes. Xi is unusual in the amount of power he's retained and his anti-Western outlook. It's possible a leader after him would have a different perspective. But for now, I think we're most likely to see this continuation of the status quo, just because with some, the status quo, they're growing closer and closer together without declaring a formal alliance. It seems to meet both their interests. There are points of contention between Russia and China, they've regularly been suppressed. So previous Russian concerns about China's growing influence in the Arctic have in recent years been just ignored, and Russia now sees China as its main potential near-term partner in the Arctic. They hope to get Chinese investment to help develop the hydrocarbon resources there. They think China will be the main user of the so-called Northern Sea Route, the sea lanes located above Russia's northern land border, which could be a means of sailing between the Europe and Asia ports without having to go through the Suez Canal, and so offers some advantages, particularly as the Red Sea has become so complicated because of what's happening in Yemen. They suppressed other differences, always minimizing those. I think just understandably, when they're willing to subordinate their differences over particular issues, particular regions, to this larger mission of sustaining their good ties, which they think is critical for dealing with the United States and other countries, as well as advancing their own desires to achieve regional spheres of influence. I think Russia's ambitions or desires to change world politics still appear greater than the Chinese. Russia would like to see a multilateral world order and replace the US-led, Western-led global order. But it has the ambitions, but not the capacity. China may have the capacity, but it doesn't yet have those ambitions of restructuring the whole international order, at least at present. They may in the future. But I think the Russians may calculate that at some point China will, particularly as the China-US confrontation continues and deepens in many areas. So those are my initial thoughts on the three areas that we discussed, the summit outcomes, which were not great, but it did highlight the part of the relationship and help us understand where things stand now. And then the larger structure and trends we've seen in the past few years, particularly regarding Ukraine, and then some speculation about where we would go in the future. Of course, we would understand more if we could get a Wikistrat sim or some other thing to look at this in detail, but I'll leave that for Oren and his team to consider. Otherwise, I'm happy to hear people's questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Richard. So there's a lot of questions, and I think if I can categorize them into labeling them, so to speak, it's the Ukraine, North Korea, Taiwan. Those are on the influence of the relationship of those. So I'll go into those, and specifically between those two countries, the relationship themselves in terms of how they're impacting internally. So I'll start with Ukraine. The first question we got, and this is by the registration forms, a lot of people ask us essentially the same question over and over again. How will the relationship impact the war in Ukraine, assuming that there is a will and a desire by the Russian to launch a counteroffensive in Ukraine? How much do they need China? How much is that for them critical for their counteroffensive and their efforts in Ukraine? And how is that impacting their war? And the second question we got a lot is how much can the U.S. pressure China or should pressure China in order to minimize their support of Russia's military efforts in order to shorten the war in Ukraine?
Right. So in terms of the military campaign, we've seen Russia be able to get weapons from Iran and particularly North Korea to help substitute and complement its own force structure. The Russia, as we've seen, has improved its capacity and effectiveness of its military operations in Ukraine recently, and has managed to rebuild its defense industrial production. So it hasn't run out of missiles and other things that people had speculated. The latter process is partly due to China. I think that I don't see any evidence that the Russians are trying to press the Chinese to provide them with arms the way they've been getting from Iran and North Korea. I think the Russians understand the Chinese wouldn't do this because that would really inflame their relations with Europe in particular. And the Chinese strategy of providing diplomatic, economic, and dual use goods that can be used for the military seems to have been successful from both of their points of view. The West and I think this was probably critical in helping the Russian military-industrial complex recover faster than people anticipated from the sanctions. I think the importance may decline a bit over time as the Russians now have achieved that rebuilding of their defense industrial complex and have improved the effectiveness of the forces. So they're probably a little bit less reliant for Chinese help in the future. That will be true with Iran and North Korea, I think, over time. The US has had a challenge here, as has its European allies. So essentially, the Chinese have followed the US red line about not providing lethal assistance, so not providing tanks or warplanes or other obvious military platforms. But these dual use goods are hard to stop because it's not, I mean, as the Chinese point out, it's not really illegal. So if they become the leader provider of smartphones in Russia and automobiles, and the Russians then take the transistors out of the smartphones and put them into weapon systems, that probably violates the end use agreements that the Chinese might have had if they had that. Certainly the drone companies have had the same phenomenon as well, but their answer has always been, these goods are legal, they're commercial goods. We don't have full visibility of what happens after we give them to the Russian clients. In some cases, if it's been specifically identified that the source of a technology is coming from a Chinese company, the Chinese company will formally end that contract. But there are just so many middlemen who are willing to do that. There's also been sales of Western technology through Hong Kong and other Chinese entities, and that's been going on for years, and for sanctions evasion to Iran, to Russia, and so on. And the U.S. can file suits and try and close off that particular trade company through sanctions. And that apparently has kept some of the bigger companies in China from doing this, but they can just find out smaller ones or create companies that only deal with Russia and therefore don't have to worry about access to the dollar. And as we know from what we're finding in Ukraine, China is not the only country involved in this. A lot of the missiles and so on that we've taken apart in Ukraine, a lot of the parts are coming from the West. Now, they may have been in high-tech items that Russians purchased before the sanctions. They may have been given by the Chinese, but they may have come in through other sources. And I think, we all know of groups in the Middle East and elsewhere that appear to be helping, in Central Asia, that appear to be buying items from Europe and the United States and then reselling them to Russia. And it's just an ongoing battle. I mean, we've seen this with the Iran sanctions issue. We can close off some trade, delay their progress in some areas, but then they try and circumvent it. Then we have to revise the sanctions. So people like to say, look, you have thousands of sanctions on Iran and Russia and North Korea. Well, that's just because you put on some sanctions and they'll change the name of the company. So you need new sanctions, or you arrest some people or prohibit and put sanctions on some individual entities, well, then other entities arise. So it's going to be a long-standing battle to try and keep this limited, but I'm not very optimistic that we can stop it entirely.
A question we received here via the chat, and I'm asking because it's in relation to this topic. Even asks, what do you think of the Chinese attitude to the enormous growth of Russia and North Korea military cooperation? Are they worried it can be destabilizing East Asia?
Yeah, that's interesting. There have been articles to that effect, that the Russian, that there's some differences, that the Chinese are concerned that with Russia, basically what Russia is providing North Korea in return for the assistance North Korea has been providing Russia in terms of ammunition, missiles, and just a general desire despite the West. So we, as mentioned, the Russians vetoed recently the planned annual extension of the panel that monitors North Korean sanctions evasion. And has been trying to change the structure of the sanctions on North Korea so that they have to be renewed annually, which would allow Russia leverage to stop them. We've also seen some evidence that the Russians are providing the North Koreans with such things as luxury goods to keep them happy, but more seriously, assistance to the North Korean space program. So that's helped them develop better surveillance satellites. We haven't seen but fear that Russia will provide assistance to North Korea's nuclear missile program. It's been speculated, and some people point to some similarities between some North Korean advances and Russian systems, but not been proven. But then the Chinese willingness to confront Russia on this issue seems to be small. China abstained on the vote not to renew the North Korean sanctions panel. There have been photos showing that a ship that was transferring weapons from, or thought to be weapons from North Korea to Russia, was in a Chinese port. So I'm not, how much China opposes or welcomes this. On the one hand, it does risk making North Korea more provocative if the North Korean military improves, if they have better nuclear capabilities, get more conventional weapons from Russia. Well, that somewhat increases the risk that they're taking provocative actions, and that could lead to a war in the Korean Peninsula, which would harm China. But it does help China gain leverage in regarding Korea. So the South Koreans, for example, will still look to China to put some pressure on Russia and North Korea to limit their relationship. So I just don't have a clear answer yet about how China is viewing this. You could argue it either way, and they've chosen not to confront Russia on this issue.
Going to the other conflict, or I would say point of tension and escalation potentially, Taiwan. A question from the crowd here is, what contribution is Russia able to make for the efforts by the Chinese in order to coerce Taiwan? How do you see that as a potential kind of collaboration between the two countries?
Right. So Russia has formally reaffirmed, it's backed China's position comprehensively in terms of their view of the One China principle and desire for eventual unification. Russia's economic dealings with Taiwan are small, so it wouldn't be able to contribute to economic coercion. Russia will back China and the UN, for example, in a confrontation over Taiwan. There's a war, I can't see the Russians getting involved, but I think their main contribution may have been through these joint exercises. They've had a lot of naval drills in which I think they've helped the Chinese improve their ability to conduct, for example, anti-submarine operations. And they've certainly provided China with substantial military technology in the 1990s and early 2000s, which really helped the Chinese Navy go from into a blue water force that provided them with substantial maritime aviation capabilities, better ship engines, sold some platforms as warships, as well as particularly missiles and warplanes. And at that time gave China a boost in how its ability to deal with Taiwan scenarios, helping to fill the gap, which though has now been reduced as China's own defense industry has improved. They can now produce these kind of weapons themselves. So I would say that China will decide its Taiwan policy focused mostly on how they think the US and perhaps Japan would react, and taking for granted but not expecting much from Russian support in any conflict involving Taiwan.
Moving to another conflict, which seems like the two states themselves are not directly involved, but a question we received was about how can you see the importance of the war in Gaza when it comes to the Russian-Chinese relation? Does it have any impact? Is it something that plays in the relationship in any way or form?
Yeah, so they've kept, as you implied, Oren, in your comment, they've kept the comment somewhat modest role on what's happening in Gaza. They both have some ties with Israel they would like to retain. Their messaging has, of course, been very pro-Palestinian, very anti-US, pointing out what US bombs are responsible for the deaths of all these Palestinians, and but I think that they are cautious about particular, the views of some of their Arab Gulf allies. They don't want to overly antagonize some of the Gulf monarchies by seeming to side too closely towards Hamas and some of the radical Sunni movements there. They it's pretty much they've just exploited this as an opportunity for messaging. Experts on the region, which I'm not, about their policies, have speculated there's some differences in their views towards a one-state solution, towards a two-state solution. Of course, the Russians have sometimes hosted the leaders of some of the resistance movements to highlight their ties there. But basically, the Middle East is an area where they pursued separate policies, and the Gaza conflict policy where they've both pursued low-key policies. I guess it's most evident in the UN Security Council debates where the Russians with Chinese backing have been denouncing the US for its various policies on UN, blocking a proposal for a full-scale ceasefire, immediate ceasefire in Gaza, which they can, publicly support whatever their private misgivings.
It seems the war in Ukraine pushed both countries into a relationship that currently is at its peak. But the question we received here is, what do you think will be the breaking point where both Russia and China won't be able to reach their disagreements and their existing friction points, which could lead to an escalation in the relationship? And on top of that, I'll add another question we received, which is, do we see signs that maybe there is a point where China maybe is reconsidering its relationship with Russia, and maybe it's open for the ways to improve the West, i.e., the United States, to improve relations with China? So it's two different questions. I'll prefer if you answer the first one, and if you do say there is such a sign, do you think there is an opening for the U.S. to improve relations with China?
Yeah, I'm going to flip those actually, because the second one is the Ukraine war would have been a great opportunity for China to reconsider its relations with Russia, right? I mean, the Chinese made and foolishly signed on to this no limit statement in a couple weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's not evident they knew what Russia was going to do precisely. Ever since, they dropped that phrase, but it's just been hanging over them, and we saw this again in media commentary over the summit. Oh, Russia and China is committed to a no-limit relationship with Russia. They've never used that language since. I'm sure they'd love to take it back, but they haven't, it hasn't led to any fundamental change in their policies towards Russia. If anything, they still continue to move closer. And I think that's broadly reflects the fact that I just don't see any change in that relationship as long as the Presidents Xi and Putin remain in power. They've both been very careful not to take steps that can antagonize the other. As I mentioned, they've continually backed off in areas where they could have. So, Russia might have concerns about China's growing influence in Central Asia, but it's chosen not to confront China on the issue. China, might worry about how the Russian war in Ukraine is hurting relations with Europe, but seems to be willing to accept some loss and hope it can manage their relations by keeping Europe divided. We saw that with President Xi's visit. He went to 3 countries he visited. 2 of them were the most pro-Russian in Europe, Serbia and Hungary. I can't see them doing anything that would antagonize the one good relationship what they have with another great power. So both Russia and China have very poor relations with most other big countries around them, and it's just hard for me to see why they would come into conflict to ruin their one good relationship, which to undermine their strategic career. I think that after they leave office, there's more opportunity to think about their coming into vision. I think the most likely precipitating factor was China would do something which would alarm the Russians so much that they would have to fundamentally reverse their policies. And that could be China is reviving its claims for lost territory from the unequal treaties of Russia, just as they've been trying to revise their territory settlements everywhere else around their periphery. They've so far spared Russia, but it's not, at some point they might want to try and regain that. I suppose if Russia were to use nuclear weapons in the Ukraine conflict, that might, alarm the Chinese. But I think that Xi and Putin are so personally invested in the relationship. They're so ideologically compatible. They see the other such useful partners to deal with the West. It's just going to have to take a leader in either of those countries is going to have a different perspective that's going to look for as the West as a potential partner, or at least as not as adversary, for them to risk doing things that will upset the other.
And one question I do have that relates to the I would say the relationship from the upcoming U.S. elections, and that is, how much do you think the relationship itself, not Russia is the situation in Ukraine and relations with Russia, or the situation Taiwan and competition, technology competition with China and so on, not individually, but that relationship will impact U.S. election, will be a topic in the U.S. election. Is there anything that the candidates may be seeing that is something that they should be going against when it comes to the relationship?
Yeah, so how much impact will it have on the U.S. elections? Minimal. I mean, most voters are going to vote on immigration, inflation, economy, value questions, how they feel about President Trump's statements, or President Biden's age, or diversity, equity, inclusion agenda, or abortion. There are just many other issues that are Trump. And foreign policy is seen to be small, even despite the student protests. Some of the polling of young people show that the Gaza war only rates about 15th in importance. So the Russia-China relationship hasn't really focused a lot. President Trump commented a bit on the first time he ran to office, saying that it was implying it was important to try and improve relations with Russia to prevent it from turning fully to China. I think, at this point, President Biden is committed to confronting Russia and China going forward as adversaries. President Trump, whatever his inclinations, he probably would like to improve relations with Russia. I think we saw from his first term that would be something that would be very difficult, something that he was quickly discarded his first term because of the difficulties. The hope that if President Trump is reelected, then the Russians might try and move away from China to reconcile with a friendly U.S. president. I just don't see that happening, given what happened the first time he was elected. I mean, the Russians were waiting for some kind of concrete deliverables. They wanted, the U.S. to pull out of its military away from Ukraine. But the Congress, the foreign partners and others just prevented Trump from perhaps doing things that could have made the Russians happy. And the Russians certainly didn't do anything to make his life any easier. They didn't announce new policies on any issues in conflict. They just thought, well, hopefully Trump will come in and change the mistaken policy. So I don't think the U.S. elections are going to have any impact, just as I don't think on the Russia-China relationship, and I don't think the Russia-China relationship will have any impact on the U.S. elections, barring some other third factor that will occur concurrently with the elections.
As we're reaching the last 10 minutes of this webinar, I will ask you two questions related to the future of the relationship. The first one is about how do you see the relationship evolving in the near future considering the recent summit and the geopolitical dynamics. So how do you see them evolving?
Right. Same. I mean, I'm not seeing anything that's going to shake it up or charge it could lead to any inflection point. So I think we'll see, economically more effort to well, I mean, I guess let me rephrase that. So Ukraine war ends, then that might be something that could cause a near-term shift, but it would probably move them even closer together because that would remove a Chinese concern about not upsetting the Europeans too much. It would mean that there would be less pressure to sanction Russia, and therefore Russian-Chinese businesses could increase. I just don't see anything that could lead to disrupt their relationship anytime soon. I think it's just a more question of how much they're going to expand economically, which depends a bit on the health of the Russian economy and the sanctions and effects and so on. Militarily, I think they're at full level. They'll have more exercises, maybe involves a couple of new partners, but essentially they're staying where they are in terms of their very close military relationship, short of an alliance. Societal wise, that's more long term. They both recognize that the alignment is pretty top down, so it's very strong among the Russia-China leaders, and some of the newly appointed Russian cabinet officials are very familiar and have worked well with the Chinese in the past. But young Russians have only recently switched from trying to learn English to trying to learn Chinese. And it's still, Russians still think of themselves, I think, more as European than Asian. But that may change. I mean, the Russian government's trying to change that. And so that could change, but not in the next few years. So my general view is I just don't see anything that's going to cause this relationship to change anytime soon, short of a removal of one or both of the leaders, because since this is so much a top-down driven relationship, if you have a new leader with has enough power and wants to go in a different direction, that could be sufficient to pull them apart in some ways.
The next question is about what are I would say, maybe the flags, the red flags that countries, and when I say countries, primarily the West, i.e. United States, Europe, should be paying attention when it comes to this relationship. So we know where the relationship is at this point. And you provided an analysis about its future. But what kind of signals could be interpreted as warning or concerning when it comes to this relationship that countries in the West should be concerned about?
Well, okay, let's break it down. I imagine the military is the main concern for many of the people watching this and thinking about this. So there's a concern that if there's a conflict between the United States and its allies and China or Russia, that the other may become involved either opportunistically or deliberately in that conflict. So let's just say NATO intervenes in Ukraine more, sends in NATO troops, extends a no-fly zone over Ukraine, etc. Would the Chinese perhaps see this as an opportunity to put more pressure on Japan or Taiwan? More interestingly, as raised by your earlier question, is when the Chinese decide, if they decide when do they decide to seize Taiwan or to impose embargo on Taiwan, to what extent will the Russians try and use this as an opportunity to exploit Western weaknesses, perhaps escalate further in Ukraine? So far this is speculative and probably not an urgent problem. I think it will become more of a problem in the next few years if their alignment stays and the U.S. has to confront a more immediate military threat from China and Taiwan. But, and I imagine you could extend it to other areas. So this time we were lucky that the Russians and Chinese didn't do anything to protect Iran when it got into a confrontation with Israel, other than cheer it on the sidelines. potentially in the future, we could see more direct support for Iran or North Korea in confrontation with the U.S. There's been some good work speculating about if there's a Korea War, how Russia and China might become involved together in that. That's probably the main area. Iran would be, as I mentioned, another. There may be others in the future. Economically, where I think people are just waiting to see how effective the new U.S. sanction policy and threats the U.S. and Europe is making on China will affect that economic relationship. If they ever do realize their ambitions to combine their economy, the Russians' ambitions anyway, to integrate the regional integration, that could really prove helpful for Russia in terms of helping it recover some of its economic potential that it's been losing because of the Ukraine war. So people wonder if they could marry up Russian intellectual know-how and experience with China's massive economic resources and human capital, whether that could make them both more powerful. For now, the Chinese economic slowdown and the sanctions on Russia have impeded that, but that's a long-term red flag we need to worry about.
Okay, Richard, thank you so much for today. I think this has been a brilliant and fascinating webinar, giving us kind of a spotlight into an ongoing relationship, which is definitely crucial and important, and definitely one of the most significant one in the international arena. So thank you so much for this. Everyone else who participated, I want to thank you for joining us to this webinar. We will publish a video of this on YouTube and share it online to our social media channels as well to our website. So stay tuned. And we are likely to have another webinar on Thursday. It wasn't planned, but considering what events that took place in Iran in the last 24 hours, so we will have a webinar with an Iran expert to discuss about the implication of what does it mean onto Iranian leadership and Iran itself. So we'll publish about that. It's still in the making, but we'll publish about that. So stay tuned. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope to see you in our next webinars. Thank you.
And thank you all for hosting me and joining.
Thank you.